Why is it that people want to hear about abolishing the income tax? Why do you think that is?
People want to hear about abolishing the income tax because people are sick and tired of complying with this behemoth tax law that we have. We've got a tax code that consists of more than 4 million words that's been changed more than 6,000 times just since 2001 alone. It creates hundreds of affirmative duties that are heaped on the shoulders of American businesses and individuals. People spend America spends tens of millions of hours every single year. I wish I had the numbers right in front of me, but I can give you approximations. But if I had the numbers right in front of me, you would be staggered by the reality of the time, the amount of time that people spend keeping records, preparing tax returns, filing the returns, keeping all the records that are necessary to make the estimated payments or the wage withholding over the course of the year, to comply with all of the withholding requirements for businesses. The American industry and individuals in industry both spend tens of millions of hours every single year in a non productive process of complying with the income tax. If we spent half as much time in productive activities as we spend in income tax compliance, the economy of the United States would grow considerably. I mean, we've got situation. The National Taxpayer Advocate did an analysis of this a couple of years ago. And again, I wish I had the data right in front of me to talk about this with some hard numbers. The data indicate that it that America spends more time in tax compliance than the productive elements of entire states. In other words, Michigan and Indiana and Illinois produce there's more time spent in tax compliance than is spent in production in those 3 states or 4 states combined. It is astonishing how much time people spend in tax compliance, and they're sick and tired of it. The burdens are overwhelming. They are counterproductive. They don't lead to any productive economic activity. It's the equivalent of taking the productive element of 3 or 4 states in the Midwest and dumping it all into the Atlantic Ocean. Nothing comes of it. It's just simply 100% waste. And people are sick and tired of it. We have to develop a system that eliminates this waste, this lack of productivity. And when you talk about abolishing the income tax and you talk about abolishing the Internal Revenue Code, it resonates because people are sick and tired of the compliance burden.
There's no question about that, and the income tax is the big one that gets targeted, but it's really the fact that there's just overtaxation at every level with state, local, and federal taxes on top of everything included. It's upwards of 50% of people's incomes now, and if people talk about how inflation is bad and everything is getting more and more expensive. Well, you'd have twice as much money if you just simply didn't have to pay the taxes that are just being sent to Ukraine anyway. So I mean, it just doesn't make much sense to people anymore.
Well, you're exactly right, but you just mixed up apples and oranges, though, Josh. It's one thing to talk about the financial tax burden that's put on people, right? So when you look at the federal, state, and local tax burdens, the dollars out of your pockets, roughly 40 to 45% of every dollar you earn goes to taxes at federal, state, and local levels. We're talking about every kind of tax. All right. So you're living on roughly 60% of the income you earn. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to stay ahead of the game here. All right. But the payment of the tax is one thing. The compliance costs are another thing. The compliance costs are the costs that you incur to pay the tax. Right? There was a
So it's a hidden tax on top of the tax, essentially.
it is because you have to for example, what am I talking about when I'm talking about compliance costs? I'm talking about the costs you bear, the costs that individuals and businesses
Opportunity cost. Yeah.
so, for example, a business that has employees has to file 4 income tax returns, or I'm sorry, 4 employment tax returns every year. 4 941s, 1 940, They have to file the W-2s and W-3s. They have to withhold the money from the paychecks of their employees. They have to account for the withholding. They have to pay that money to the IRS. They have to issue a W-2 form to the employee every year. That gets filed with both the IRS and the Social Security Department. So all of these things go into what we call the compliance burden. All right. A friend of mine, a guy named James Payne, did a study years and years ago called Costly Returns, a magnificent book where he studied specifically the compliance costs. What does it cost to comply with the Internal Revenue Code? Not pay the tax. That's different. All right. These costs are in addition to paying the tax. And Payne did a remarkable study and came up with the bottom line that the compliance costs are 65% of the amount paid in. So what that means is for every dollar you pay in income taxes, it costs you another 65 cents to get it there. Now, these costs are disproportionately loaded on small businesses. All right, individual citizens that file a 1040 short form don't have a 65% compliance cost. But the fact of the matter is, they're disproportionately loaded on businesses in general, because businesses are the ones that are incurring the cost to collect the tax. The IRS brags, Josh, the IRS brags that they are the most efficient government agency there is in the United States, and they would argue on the planet, because they only spend about 50 cents of about 50 cents of costs for every $100 of tax collected. And if you look at it that way, the IRS's budget of roughly 12, well, now it's more like $20 billion, compared against the nearly $5 trillion they collect. Right, that's pretty good ratio, right? So that's where they get that 50 cents of expenditure for every $100 of taxes collected. But the reality is that 60 cents of every dollar collected by the IRS is not collected by the IRS. 60 cents of every federal dollar paid into the Treasury is paid in by businesses through wage withholding. They're the ones that have to do it. The IRS isn't collecting that money. Businesses are collecting that money. They're withholding from their employers, from their employees. They're withholding the Social Security tax, the Medicare tax, and the income tax. They're depositing that money on at least a quarterly, if not monthly, or even weekly basis, depending on the payroll. They're the ones that are collecting it and depositing it to Treasury direct accounts through the IRS's website, through what they call the EFTPS system. Businesses incur these expenses. The IRS doesn't incur these expenses. All right. And if businesses fail somehow to do what they're supposed to do, of course, now the IRS goes to enforcement mode with wage levies, bank levies, property seizures, and tax liens. This is why the idea of abolishing the Internal Revenue Service and the income tax resonates so loudly, so vividly with the American public. They're sick and tired of the compliance burdens.
They're sick of the IRS claiming to be this great well-oiled machine. Well, in fact, it's on the back of the American taxpayers that
On
all
the
of that
back of
happens,
the American
anyways.
taxpayer. That's who bears the cost. The IRS uses this phrase, and it's just a complete fraud. They say our system is based on voluntary compliance. And what they mean by that is that there's not a police officer in the kitchen or in the office, an IRS police officer. Let me rephrase that and say there's not an IRS enforcement officer in the kitchen of every home, in the office of every business in America, holding a gun to their head and making sure that they file their tax returns on time and pay their taxes on time.
But there is in spirit.
98, say again?
But there is in spirit, not
There is in
physically,
spirit. You're
not
exactly
physically,
right.
but there is in spirit, and that's the thing.
There is in
I
spirit.
love I
No
love that
question
I
about it.
love that
Because
compliance is voluntary line, because voluntary, what, so staying out of jail is voluntary, I guess, in that sense. I mean,
exactly right. And here's how they define the phrase. All right. So let's understand what they're talking about. They say that voluntary compliance means that the individual and the business acts in a manner that's in full compliance with the tax law without IRS intervention. So, in other words, a person files the returns they're supposed to file, pays the taxes they're supposed to pay without IRS intervention. The IRS will tell you that 98%, this is a real number, of every federal dollar collected by the IRS is not collected by the IRS. It is paid in to the system by businesses and individuals without IRS enforcement action.
Voluntarily.
2%,
Right.
only 2% of federal revenue is collected by the IRS through enforcement action. So when they talk about voluntary compliance, they're talking about people complying with the law without the need of IRS intervention. That's not voluntary in the sense that I can choose to comply or not. All right. The word voluntary means that I've got a free will choice to do something or not do something. That's not what we're talking.
What they're talking about is it's either you voluntarily send us the money, or we voluntarily charge you with tax fraud. There's your options.
It's what I call it the Vito Corleone definition of voluntary compliance.
Mhm.
Vito Corleone said either your brains or your signature will be on the contract. And that's what IRS means by voluntary compliance. Either your brains or your signature will be on the 1040 form. And so people say, okay, where do I sign? They sign the tax return, they file the return, and they pay the money. There's nothing voluntary about it. There's over 140 different penalty provisions in the tax code, Josh, including interest penalty provisions, right?
Right.
So between penalties and interest, the typical delinquent tax liability increases by about 280%. And so the IRS takes a difficult situation and turns it into an impossible one when people don't pay on time, and of course those 140 different penalty provisions include the criminal penalties: failure to file a tax return, failure to pay the tax evasion, submitting false documents to the IRS. Those all carry criminal penalties that can include imprisonment, and do include imprisonment. And so to say that this is a voluntary system, it's just a complete fraud. There's nothing voluntary about
Oh,
it.
and not to mention all of the examples made out of the people who have, gone with the, oh, it's voluntary route, so I'm going to stop paying. Because that's what is that called? A frivolous argument?
It's called a frivolous argument. That's exactly right. It is listed on the IRS's published list of frivolous positions for which they will pursue either criminal penalties, which they do fairly regularly, or substantial civil penalties for making those arguments.
Our system is held up by voluntary compliance, but also our tax system is voluntary is a frivolous argument.
Yeah,
Which one is it? Which how does that work?
it's absurd. It's an absurdity. That's what it is.
It's very confusing at the very least. So there's a lot of people on the internet that love to say, it's voluntary, just stop paying them. But that's the reality is, Irwin Schiff, all these people out there have tried this method, and the real thing that needs to happen, the real solution is to just bulldoze the IRS, abolish the whole thing, abolish the income tax, and replace it with you say a retail sales tax. Explain why.
National retail sales tax assessed on all goods and services at the point of purchase, at the final point of retail purchase, because that is the simplest, it is the most efficient, it is the fairest system that there can possibly be for an income tax system. And if we make the sales tax collectible by the state, in other words, the states collect the tax piggyback with their own state sales tax. About 44, 45 of the 50 states out there, maybe even 46 of the 50 states out there currently have a sales tax. And so it would be no extra work for the states to collect the federal tax piggyback with their own state sales tax. And then the state is responsible for sending that portion of the federal revenue into the Treasury Department. So we got 50 states out there. Right now, the Internal Revenue Service's budget is roughly about $22 billion a year. They've got about 90,000 employees. All right. What we would do is we would take that infrastructure and we would run the number of employees that are necessary to deal with this at the Treasury level down to what, a couple hundred, couple, 3, 4, 5 employees per state is all you'd need. The budget would go from $20 billion, $22 billion, whatever it is, down to, a couple of million, 4, 5, 10 million to operate that. And so the enforcement arm would be pointed at the various states and not at individuals and businesses. And this is what the founders envisioned. The founders never intended for the federal government to have its hands directly in the pockets of individuals and businesses. Rather, they intended the states to be collecting the tax and the federal government to deal with the states. And so that's why a retail sales tax collected by the state is so efficient and so effective.
I just want to comment on the pure joy it would bring me to see state officials audited by the IRS for not paying their state sales taxes on time. Just to have that shoe on the other foot for a second, it brings me a little bit of joy.